Here we are. Okay, we're all ready to go here. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you, Patty, for that wonderful introduction that we had. So I'll just get right into it. This is an overview of some of the background and the major points of the book that I published recently, the Newburgh Conspiracy. And for those of you who are from Newburgh, you may be familiar with some parts of the story, but hopefully I can put it in a bigger context and also share something new about what I've learned in the process of doing my research. So the Newburgh Conspiracy story takes place at the end of the American Revolution. And at the end of the American Revolution, there's this kind of strange 2-year period after the final major battle, which is the Battle of Yorktown, when the Americans are victorious and the British surrender. Can I have a huzzah for that? Well, if you weren't all muted, I guess I would hear a resounding huzzah. But the war itself, the formal peace treaty, does not arrive in the United States until 2 years later, until the fall of 1783. So there's this strange 2-year period where the war is technically still going, but there's not a lot of fighting. But there could be fighting, but it turns out they're not. But of course, nobody knows that at the time. They don't know that there's no more fighting coming. So it's kind of period of kind of anxious waiting. And what makes it so anxious is the reality that militarily the war is not over, because the British still occupy major positions within the United States. And again, if you weren't muted, I know you'd give a resounding boo to the continued British presence in North America. The British hold cities such as Charleston, Savannah, and most importantly, New York City. So the British are still occupying those cities, and of course they could break out of those cities and continue the war at any moment. Washington has to remind people following the victory at Yorktown that the war is not over. He said that again and again. People would write him saying, "Congratulations, this surely means that we'll have peace and independence any day now." And Washington had to tell them, "No, it's not over. We need to continue to prepare as if the war is going to continue for certain." That's what Washington's major message is from the end of 1781 until the war is officially over, is that it could continue at any time. During this period, a number of problems emerge in a more conspicuous way than those problems had been visible previously. So things that had always been going on during the war, but the urgency of fighting the war had always kind of papered over. Some of these problems were fiscal. So the cost of fighting the war was absolutely enormous, far beyond what anybody had ever imagined was possible. The Continental Congress, which was the closest thing to a central government at the time during the war, used several methods to finance the war effort. One of those efforts was simply to print money. And this is an example of some of the money that the U.S. government printed. And when they needed more money, they would order a new batch of dollars. And then they would print more and more and more, and then a little more before even more. They printed nearly $200 million worth. That's $200 million in nominal currency, in 18th century money, not corrected for inflation or anything like that. So just an enormous amount of money was simply printed. And of course, you all know what happens when you print a lot of money, you print it indiscriminately, the value of the dollar starts to shrink. Okay, that was very clever, don't you think?
Yes, it was.
I worked hard on that. You got to, do a more visual presentation style here. So the value of the dollar shrank, and there was runaway inflation. The Continental Congress gave up printing money. I believe it was 1779. They just stopped printing money. It wasn't worth it anymore. They were ruining perfectly good blank paper. Of course, the war still had several more years to go. A couple other financial problems that the country faced was enormous debt. So the United States borrowed a lot of money, principally from France, also borrowed from domestic American citizens, people in the United States, would lend some money to the United States government. Paying back those debts is going to be an enormous problem, especially when nobody really trusts the government to make good on its promises, because it has just simply printed the money and eroded the value of everybody's dollars. Here is a little detail that I like. This is the picture, the image from that $4 note that I showed a second ago. This is the design. They all have these, patriotic designs. I like the animal ones. This is a wild boar, and it has the Latin motto, either death or an honorable life. And the person who designed these was Benjamin Franklin, because in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin does everything. Right? He experiments in the lightning, he invents stoves and bifocals, negotiates treaties, right? He does everything. So he designed the currency. The wild boar was considered a patriotic animal. It was a patriotic animal because the wild boar liked to be left alone. But if we're provoked, then it would be ferocious in self-defense. And that was seen as kind of an allegory of the American situation. The colonies were happy to be left alone. Once the British provoked them, then they were ferocious in self-defense. Okay? So I like that. We could have had, instead of the bald eagle as our symbol, the wild boar, I think would have been good too. Okay, so I like to highlight that. Again, I like the animals designs there. Now, addressing the fiscal problems is very difficult given the structure of the government in the 1780s. There was a Continental Congress, and it met in Philadelphia, but its powers were very circumscribed. The states held most of the powers. So Congress would ask the states to do things, and the states would decide whether to do those things or not. So Congress would pass a spending bill, set a budget, and it would ask the states to come up with the money to fund the budget for the year, and the states would have to come up with the money. Or they would come up with reasons why they were given an unfairly high number to come up with, and why somebody else should pay more, and why they should pay less, and all that kind of thing. Sometimes the reasons were very understandable, such as that their major seaport was occupied by the British. Well, that will hamper any state's ability to pay tax money. That's New York's situation. But every state had a reason why it was being treated unfairly. And that was usually the relationship between the states and the Congress. The states would decide what they wanted to do. Congress would make recommendations. They would pass resolutions. They wouldn't pass laws, but resolutions about how the states should act. It was up to the states to decide. And that was the structure of the government under the Articles of Confederation. In many ways, the Congress was kind of like the UN today. So a body that is kind of like a diplomatic body that would coordinate activity among the members. So the 13 states really prized their independence, not only from Britain, but from each other. So kind of negotiating kind of diplomatically between them was a big deal. And then a kind of security function, which would be fighting the war. So those things really make the Continental Congress more like the UN than it was like the US government that we know today. So Congress does not have a lot of power to act independently on any of the issues that it faces. Meanwhile, with the Army, the bulk of the Army is encamped in the Hudson Valley region. So in and around Newburgh, where many of you are located. This was a contemporary picture that was done in the 1780s of the Hudson Valley. So after Yorktown, part of the Army is stationed in South Carolina, but most of the Army then takes up quarters in the Hudson Valley to keep an eye on the British position in New York City. In case the British decide to break out of New York, the American Army would be there to oppose them. So that's where most of the Army is. This is Washington's headquarters. So again, many of you may know this building, the State Historic Site. You can go visit. So this is from a picture from when I went to visit 4 years ago now. It's when I was there, took this picture. You may or may not know the story of this house. So it was owned by a Dutch widow before Washington moved in and made it his headquarters. And the officer who's in charge of finding lodging for Washington had a really hard time finding a place that would be suitable. It had to be defensible from the British. It had to have good communications with the rest of the Army, and it had to have a certain amount of land for the horses and all that kind of stuff. And this Washington didn't travel light. He had a lot of guys with him. And they found this house, and the Dutch widow there, she did not really want to give it up to Washington. They're going to pay her, but, you know, make all kinds of improvements to the kitchen and stuff, make it bigger. She didn't like it. She said that the house was not big enough for both her and General Washington, and she left. So you might have thought it'd be an honor to have Washington in your house. No, it was just a big inconvenience. This is where the bulk of the army lodged in New Windsor, right, which is just a couple of miles away. This is also a state historic site today, and this is a replica of the cantonment that the army built. The original was torn down. It was just sort of temporary housing. But I think in the 1960s, the state of New York rebuilt it as a historic site. So this is one of the cabins that they made, or they call it a hut. So it seems a little big for a hut to me, but that is what they lived in. I would like to live there alone and contemplate life, but the army would live about 12 to 15 men in that space. I think I calculated, or I saw that it's about 1,000 square feet. So 1,000 square feet with 12 other guys all winter long. Yeah, that's not good. So that's what the lodging was like. Now the officers, as they are kind of sitting around in Newburgh in their huts there, they start to see that there's a problem with the way the war is winding down. In 1781 to 82, and then 82 to 83 especially. What they're really looking forward to at the end of the war, besides the end of the war, is they want their money and they want pensions. Most soldiers, most officers had gone without pay throughout the whole war. They've been paid kind of sporadically. Of course, when they were paid, it was in money that wasn't worth anything. And really the full pay was not there. So they wanted that pay, the back pay, and they wanted it adjusted for inflation. The officers, not the enlisted men, but the officers have been promised pensions a couple of times during the war. This was a promise by Congress that was made to stop a series of resignations. The officers have been resigning en masse on a couple of points. To keep them in the army, they were promised pensions at the end of the war. Eventually, the last promise is that they would get half pay for life. So whatever their last salary was, they'd get half of that for the rest of their lives. Now, this is kind of great politics, or the things politicians like to do. Maybe I'm just cynical. Politicians, I think, love to make promises that solve problems at the time, if those problems can be paid for at some point in the future, when somebody else is on the hook for figuring it out. And that's exactly what was done with the pensions. The officers were made a promise, they stayed in the service, it was up to somebody else to figure out where the money is. That time eventually came in 1782 and then into 1783. It's time to figure out where the money is. Well, the officers can see that Congress has done nothing to secure that money, to have some kind of fund or system to pay the pensions and their back pay. They can see that Congress has been big on promises and very light on follow-through. A further problem has to do with the timing. The officers fear that if they are disbanded without a settlement, then the chances of them ever getting a settlement go down very close to zero, because they think they have maximum leverage while the war is still going on, because the civilians need them. If they wait till after the war, when the civilians don't need them, then the officers are very suspicious that the Congress will say, sorry guys, we don't have the money. Thanks for your service. We really like how you won the war. That was great. But we just don't have the money for you. Sorry. So they can see that kind of thing happening. And as day follows day, and there's no news from Europe where the peace treaty is being negotiated, well, that just makes them more anxious that there is nothing going on with the settlement, but peace could come on the next ship. The next day could bring a news of a peace settlement. And for some officers, they get the feeling that they start to think the war is ending too quickly. No one comes out and says it that baldly, but that's the feeling that some start to have, I suspect, is that they want to stretch things out so that they get that settlement first, the money first, and then they can be sent home. That's what they would really like to have. But they're afraid the order is going to be the opposite. The war will end, they'll be sent home and told, yeah, we'll settle up with you later. That's what they're afraid of. The officers, they get themselves organized and make a formal protest, send a formal message to Congress at the very end of 1782. And this is an image from the letter that, one copy of the letter that I found here. This is actually pretty good handwriting, if you can believe it. I think this is Samuel Shaw was I think that's where I got this copy from. He was an aide to Henry Knox, who was the commander at West Point in this period. Henry Knox had awful handwriting, like indecipherable. Samuel Shaw, he gets an A for me. Henry Knox, he gets an F, his bad handwriting. So if you can't make this out here, I'll read part of this. This is one of the key passages. So this is a letter from the officers to Congress explaining their needs and asking for something to be done for their paying their pensions. The officers wrote, "Our distresses are now brought to a point. We have borne all that men can bear. Our property is expended, our private resources are at an end, and our friends are wearied out and disgusted with our incessant applications." As you can imagine, they've been harassing everybody they know for help, and nobody wants to hear from them anymore. It goes on to close, "The uneasiness of the soldiers for want of pay is great and dangerous, and any further experiments on their patients may have fatal effects." Now they do something very clever here. They say the uneasiness of the soldiers is great and dangerous. They don't say us officers, but it doesn't take a lot of reading between the lines to see that the officers probably feel in a similar way. Okay, so they don't want any more experiments on their patients. A delegation from the officers takes that message to Philadelphia. The congressmen in Philadelphia, they agree that the officers have a just reason to complain. Delegates in Philadelphia agree that they would like to help the officers. The problem is that there just isn't the money. They don't see how they have the money already. They don't see where they're going to get the money from. They start debating what they're going to do to raise a new source of revenue to find the money for the officers. So that's the situation in January, February of 1783. Conditions change when an anonymous letter circulates through the camp in Newburgh and in New Windsor, and also down to West Point. This is over 1 week in March of 1783. All the crisis sort of comes to a head. This anonymous letter calls on the officers to meet and to discuss a stronger response to Congress, something more aggressive than their previous letter. And again, this is some of the words here I'll read to you. The anonymous letter said, "Change the milk and water style of your last memorial. Assume a bolder tone, decent but lively." And then goes on to say, to turn your appeal from the justice to the fears of the government. Okay? So putting a stronger spin on things. Now, in itself, that doesn't sound too bad. I mean, assume a bolder tone, but decent and lively. That's just good writing, is decent but lively. Later on in the letter, there's a stronger passage in which the author of the letter asks the officers to consider their options, their alternatives, as the letter says. The options are, if there's peace, then the officers could refuse to disband. They could stay in the field and force Congress to turn over their money. Or if the war continues, the letter said, the officers didn't have to fight. They could just abandon the field, move to some deserted country, and leave the civilians to their own devices. That part there was very inflammatory. So there's both a decent part to this, or an understandable, moderate, reasonable part, calling for a decent but lively letter, and then a indecent part that seems to be threatening open rebellion against the civilian leaders. Washington's response one of those things I would love to be outside the house that day to hear Washington's response. The only account I have of this is from an officer who said Washington was amazingly agitated. Washington had a terrible temper. He mostly kept it buttoned up. Washington has very good self-control, but it came out time and again. Especially to people Washington saw every day, he would have kind of, minor explosions. Alexander Hamilton was an aide to Washington, and he got sick of Washington always yelling at him because, he was there, and Washington could yell at him, and he, could take his abuse. Washington would explode at his enslaved people at Mount Vernon also were the object often of his harsh words. That's why I said I wanted to be outside the building, not inside with Washington. I wanted to be outside, so I'm sure I could hear everything he said. His public response, however, was much more measured. Washington waited until the next day, and he issued in the regular orders that the officers could meet, but they had to meet on his terms. He gave them the time and the date at noon on March 15th, and the place, the Temple of Virtue, a building in the New Windsor Cantonment, and he gave them their directive that they were to maturely deliberate on the measures that would have the best chance of securing their object, meaning their pay and their pensions. So it kind of gives them a few days to cool off, get their act together, and then deliberate maturely on how to address Congress. So that's what he allowed them. That's the message he sent to them. Kind of, this is not a problem. It's not a rebellion or anything. They can meet, but they have to deliberate maturely after they cool off. Okay? So that's Washington's plan. Now, on the day itself, on March 15th, 1783, the officers met here at the Temple of Virtue. That's kind of a grandiose name to a very simple building. So one-story log building. It had been constructed just a month earlier. In February of 1783, it was finished. And it was just a building, kind of multi-use building. So, they could have chapel there on Sundays. They could have meetings. They could have social events, dances. There's some office space, some storage space, a little bit of everything at the Temple of Virtue. Washington called it very unimaginatively the New Building. It's the New Building. Some of the junior officers gave it a grander, I think it's a Masonic origin, the Freemason Temple of Virtue, I suspect is where that came from. I should say here the date, March 15th, the Ides of March, right? Infamous. I think it was just a coincidence. There was that just happened to be the Saturday of that particular week. The calendar fell a different way. It would have been March 16th, but it was March 15th, and it's just a coincidence that it has that infamous Ides of March association. This is the inside of the Temple of Virtue. The benches wouldn't have been there. The men would have stood. Okay, those benches there because they do programming there and have people sit there. So it kind of stood around here. I hate to break it to you, but this fire extinguisher is not authentic to the period. Okay. That is not a true 18th century fire extinguisher. Okay. How do you build a historic building up to code? I wonder what the fire code and all that building code is on historic recreations. That'd be an interesting question. Okay, so this wouldn't have been there. The meeting is about to start at noon, and then Washington shows up as a surprise visitor. He hadn't said whether he was coming or not, but all indications were that he was not going to come. And then he takes them by surprise and walks through the door. Washington then stands on the dais here. It's raised above the men. He doesn't really need the extra inches, but that makes him look, positively larger than life. And he delivers a impassioned speech in which he denounces the anonymous letter. He says that it sounds more like something that someone from occupied New York would have sent. Right? A British subject who hates the army would have tried to sow these divisions between the army and the civilians. And he goes on and on like that. Eventually, Washington's major argument is that the men should trust him, that he trusts Congress, and that if he trusts Congress and the men trust him, then they should trust Congress as well. Right? He's there to beg on Congress's behalf for their continued perseverance, to preserve their honor, not to let their honor go in a fit of pique or anger. Everybody suffered. Don't throw it all away now. After Washington finishes his speech, he plans to read a letter sent to him from a Virginia congressman named Joseph Jones. He's one of Washington's neighbors from Virginia, as much as Washington, who owns just an enormous amount of land, can be said to have any neighbors at all. So he knows Jones from back in Virginia. And Washington's going to read this letter as evidence of Congress's good intentions. Jones's letter, in a nutshell, it says, we're working on the problems. We move slowly because that's the way the Articles of Confederation sets up things, but we're working on it. Don't lose heart. We're going to get the money. Okay. So Washington wants to read this. He takes the letter, and he looks at it in handwriting small. He can't read it very well. His own speech he'd written out in his own hand. It was large, and he could see it. But this handwriting, he can't read very well. Like, uh-oh. All right, what are you going to do? So Washington had started wearing glasses the previous month, his first pair of glasses. And no one had really seen him, except the men at headquarters would have been the only ones to see him with his glasses. And he pauses to take them out and put them on. Now, there would have been kind of an awkward silence here. If you remember how we all were a few minutes ago, just kind of waiting around for things to begin before the meeting started, right? Like that kind of thing, right? And you can see the way the glasses are. They don't just slip them on like glasses today. You kind of fold them around your head to make sure they stay on, that kind of thing. These are the lenses. These are kind of loops in the back to keep the pressure on the back of your head. Okay, so there's an awkward silence. And this is how Washington, being a gentleman, right, knows how to handle those little inconveniences. He says some version of the quote you have here on the slide. Different people remember it slightly differently. But he more or less says, you see, gentlemen, that I have not only grown gray, but also blind in your service. And that seems to have broken kind of the tension. And whatever lingering doubt there was, people can see how much the war has affected Washington, how much he has given in their service. And they're willing to give him another chance. You can see the very small variations here that I like, this little pondering. One first remembered, it was in Washington said he'd grown gray and blind in your service. Another said in their service. Another remembered the service. So this one sounds more personal, like Washington had served him personally. This was more of a group that he had served, the officers as a group had served them. And this one is more the nation as a whole, the service. Okay. So just very slight variation there. And I'm convinced he said some version of growing gray and blind in somebody's service. Washington leaves, and then the meeting continues. The officers, they vote unanimously to call the letter infamous and to ask Washington to intercede with Congress on their behalf. Okay. And then the matter, very quickly, then the news of the peace arrives, and Congress has to kind of scramble to come up with the money. I can talk about what happens next, the rest of the story, if anybody's interested in the later portion of the talk today. I do want to talk a little bit about the conspiracy part of this. Where does the term Newburgh Conspiracy come from? Well, people in the 18th century thought everything was a conspiracy. I mean, there was no possibility of something just being random or mistake or something. Events happened because somebody was planning it. And that's part of where the conspiracy thinking comes from in general. In particular, the conspiracy thinking in this particular episode comes from the suspicion that somebody put the officers up to writing this anonymous letter. Somebody put them up to it. They couldn't have done it themselves. It must have been somebody for some ulterior motive must have put them to write this letter. The letter was written by this man, John Armstrong Jr. This is the only painting that I can find. He was in his 20s at the time. Here he is he's 25 years older. He goes on to be, I believe, the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War. Secretary of Defense is post-World War II. Secretary of War, later on. He's only 40-something. He's already bald, so yeah, he does look much older than he was. But yeah, imagine him 25 years younger. He wasn't an old man when he wrote this letter. He's a younger guy. So he actually wrote the letter. And the feeling is, among some people suspect that He was put up to it by these Philadelphia politicians and administrators. This is Robert Morris. Robert Morris was the superintendent of finance, roughly a treasury secretary. And this is Morris's assistant, Gouverneur Morris, who was not related. They just had the same last name and worked together, which must have been confusing who was getting whose mail. So this is Robert and Gouverneur Morris. And then this man over here is Alexander Hamilton. He was a delegate from New York. Now, all three of these figures would really wanted to see the central government made stronger, so that the central government could have a fund of money of its own to pay down the debts on its own without having to ask the states for permission for things. And the feeling is that, well, maybe these three guys, or one of them or some of them, got to this guy here and encouraged him to rile up the army. Another thing, another aspect of the conspiracy, if there was a conspiracy, centers on this man here. This is General Horatio Gates. He was the second in command at the encampment in Newburgh and New Windsor. And he is suspected, one, because earlier in the war he was a rival of Washington. He certainly did not, was not, most officers adored Washington. Other officers thought Washington was just lucky and they could have done just as well if they had the chance. That's kind of the general attitude. Either love him or think, I could have done it. There's nothing special about Washington. Gates is in that latter camp, but thinks there's nothing special, that he could have done it just as easily. The letter, when it's written by Armstrong, was written in this house. This is where Gates had his headquarters. So in Gates's headquarters, Armstrong was an aide to Gates. He's living in the same house. And they wrote the letter one night in that house. So, Gates must have known something was up. So I don't know if he's like, calling downstairs, "Hey boys, time to go to bed. It's, what are you doing?" Like nothing, General. Just fomenting a rebellion. No. So he must have known something was up. Like, why are these guys over at the house all night? Writing, didn't know. So at the very least, he should have known something was going on there. In the book, I talk a lot about going through the case for a conspiracy. Just so I don't give everything away in the talk here, I'll say that I am skeptical that there was a conspiracy. That was more likely was that there was an alignment of interests between the officers and the politicians who wanted to see a stronger central government. The officers wanted the government to be able to tax to get more money to pay them off. And so that was in their political interest. They didn't necessarily need to be doing anything untoward. I do think that Armstrong and some of his friends around him acted on their own and acted foolishly. Their letter was part moderate, but also went too far. They probably should have slept on it, done another draft in the morning, and really thought it through, but they didn't. And so they have this inflammatory part that everybody seizes on, and that comes to be seen as evidence of conspiracy when, to my mind, they just went too far, and they just didn't write it the right way. I mean, they should have revised it one more time. I could talk more about that if people would like, but that brings me to the end of the presentation here. I have my contact information there. My website, email, and please, Twitter, Facebook. I encourage people to stay in touch if they have further questions in the future. That's the handsome cover of the book there. My 3-year-old, when I ask her who's that man on the cover, she says, "Daddy," and I'm not going to tell her any different. So thank you for coming and for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.